Hello everyone, this is Shantanu here. Today I'm going to talk about OAuth, and the agenda is to talk about a typical three-legged OAuth 2.0 in terms of an use case and give you a small demonstration, and towards the end I'll wrap it up with uh, the details on how I have implemented this particular demo. So let's get quickly started. In a three-legged OAuth, of course there are three parties, that's why it's called three-legged OAuth. First, the end user, who is the resource owner, then the OAuth provider, who also in this case protects the end user resources or holds the resources on the end user's behalf, and then the developer application, which accesses this end user resources after obtaining the end user's consent. So before anything can start, the end user of course needs to have the relationship with the OAuth provider, which is as a prerequisite, and then the developer app needs to, or the developer needs to register their app and obtain the corresponding credentials like the client ID, client secret from the OAuth provider for the purpose of developer app identification. That also happens out of band and before the actual OAuth dance can start. That's shown in the dotted line as number 1 in the diagram. Then when the actual runtime starts with the application, the end user intends to share their resource with the app redirects the user to the OAuth provider, as you can see in the step number 3 of the diagram. Then the end user completes the authentication process because the OAuth provider needs to know if the end user is who he claims to be. So the end user needs to identify and authenticate, and finally provide consent to share their resources with the identified developer app. Once that process is complete, in the step number 5, OAuth provider redirects the end user back to the developer's provided redirect URI. In this redirect URI, the developer app then extracts the OAuth code. The OAuth code signifies that the end user actually is authenticated for this purpose. With that OAuth code, the developer app then goes back to the OAuth provider to obtain an access token. This access token request happens behind the scene. It does not interact with the end user in any way. So the end user is not aware of the access token, like the developer app is not aware how the end user authenticates with the OAuth provider. The OAuth spec does not specify the end user interaction, doesn't say it's a single factor, two factor, how the actual authentication process, identification and authentication process happens with the OAuth provider. So number 4 is separate from the developer, which is end user authentication. Similarly, developer app obtaining the access token is completely separate from the end user's purview. This is how the three parties are separate from each other. So as the number 6 is done, now the developer app has an access token. With the access token, the developer app can continue to access the end user resource. Here, this access is limited by scope, which is a parameter in the OAuth, and during the consent process, the OAuth provider grants, or OAuth provider is able to keep track of the grants that is given by the end user, right? So it could be limited by type of resources, it could be limited by time, and so on. And within that time period of the consent, the developer app can also renew the access token if it is supported by the OAuth provider by means of a refresh token. Finally, the end user also has a way to manage the consents that he or she has distributed to various apps. Either he or she can view, or he or she can change the consent or completely revoke the consent for a particular app. Okay, let's get to the demo now. So in this demo, I'm going to use APG console as an app simulator or an app-like environment, and for the server side, I'm going to use APG Edge, where my OAuth is already implemented. And for the particular use case, I'm going to request end users preferred movies That means the server side already know who the end user is, what their preferences are, and hence the server side is able to provide some recommended movies for the end user. So as a developer app, I'm going to request the recommended movie for the end user following a OAuth based consent process. That is the demo. So before I start, I would I would try to access the resources from this console. This console is nice. It basically shows me the list of different resources I have. I can request on the server side. These are my REST-based APIs. So let me try to request the JSON-based movies recommendation. Now I'm going to try this before I try to do any sort of authentication or OAuth. And naturally, the server is throwing me out saying this is unauthorized access and there is no access token or invalid access token, right? Now, before I start doing the OAuth process, let me quickly go and start trace on the server side so that I know what's going on the server when this request flow in and out. So this will make us very clearly understand what's going on, right? Here is my app, and now I'm going to start with the OAuth process, OAuth 2. So I'm going to start authenticating with Acme, who is my server-side provider in this case. It's a browser warning, ignore that. Then you can see the app is now redirecting me to the Acme, which is server-side OAuth provider's login page. In this login page, the OAuth provider is requesting me to sign on, and as I sign in, it will be able to identify me, and then it will be able to ask me for allowing consent to the specific app, because the server side can identify the app based on the client ID provided during the OAuth process. Now if I allow consent, this will redirect me back to the application's redirect URL, in this case the APG console. So I'm going to give consent. Now the control is going to come back to my OAuth um, side of the app, and once that is done, it is going to show me that Acme authenticated user. So now it has a this console has an access token. It has obtained the access token behind the scene, and I'll show you in a moment that particular request as well. So now that this console or the app has the access token, it should be able to go and make the request. Let me try this now. So as you can see, this time the request was made with an access token, and there was a legitimate response coming back from the server, and the server has come back with a bunch of Action Hero, Action Jackson, and a bunch of movies based on some theme around action. Looks like action is action movies is this user's preference. Okay, so this was the demo. Let's quickly have a look at the server side, right? So on the server side, this is of course the request that we just saw went through. So there is access token validation, and then there is a backend request that goes to some backend to get the movies request back. This is the response content. But there is also another set of interaction for the OAuth. Actually, there are three OAuth based requests. One is the initial request to authorize. In the authorized request, there was a redirect response from the server to the login page. Then of course there is an internal redirect for once the login was complete, it was redirecting it back to the application. And finally there is access token request from the app to the server side to obtain the access token, in which the access token response should have been sent back like this with a refresh token as well. It's chopped off, but you can see the this JSON schema which sends back the access token response. So this should be the same access token that would be used for, actually the access token is not visible, it's somewhere down. So it should be the same access token that is used in the subsequent request for getting the list of movies. So this was the demo, as you can see, and I'll come back with more later on. Thank you.